David Alvarez grew up with an awareness of colonialism. As a child, he was born and raised on the British outpost of Gibraltar. And today, as a professor of English at Grand Valley State University, he teaches the literature of colonialization. This has led him on to a wider journey, which we will talk about now. David, it's been a challenge to coordinate our schedule, but thanks for hanging in there and making your way to the studio.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Growing up in Gibraltar, most people don't understand that. Tell us about your background and a little bit about that small slice of the world.
Well, Gibraltar is a very old town. It was founded in the 1200s by Arabs and Berbers, Moorish Arabs and Berbers, who ruled over the Iberian Peninsula at the time. They ruled it for about 200 years. Then it was taken by the Spaniards. It was a Spanish town for about 200 years. And then at the start of the 18th century, the British captured it, and it's been in British hands ever since. The original Spanish population fled to the neighbouring area of Spain, and immigrants started arriving from all over the Mediterranean, from Italy, from Malta, from southern France, from Spain itself, from Portugal and elsewhere, from Morocco, and in the fullness of time, by the end of the 19th century, there was an ethnically homogeneous group of people who called themselves the Gibraltarians, at least in English, Gibraltareños in Spanish, and they live on this roughly 2.5 square mile lump of limestone at the very entrance of the Mediterranean. It's a spectacular location. If you climb to the top of the famous Rock of Gibraltar and you look south, you see the Africa spreading out, as far as the eye can see, the mountains of northern Morocco. If you look west or you look north, you see Spain, the southernmost mountains of Spain, and if you look east, you've got the Mediterranean spreading out to infinity. So it is a spectacularly beautiful location, and nowadays a very lovely cosmopolitan place to live. However, when I was growing up there, the border with our neighbour Spain was closed because, well, for one reason principally, and that is that the Spanish dictator Francisco Franco, when his regime won the Spanish Civil War, when his people won the Spanish Civil War, they realized that there was only one issue, really, around which all Spaniards could agree, right? And that is that Gibraltar should never have become British. It ought to return to Spanish rule. And so they began to mount restrictions at the border. And by the time I was born in 65, those restrictions had been in place for a couple of years. And then by the time my brother was born in 69, in that year, the border was closed. And the idea was simply to force the Gibraltarians to accept Spanish rule by force, right, to pressure them into making life so difficult for the Gibraltarian people, who had in numerous ties of culture and language and trade and commerce with the neighbouring Spanish communities, to cut them off from all that and say, see how you like that. This was a regime that maltreated its own minorities, right, the Catalans and the Basques, so it's no surprise that they should treat us like that.
And everyone wants their own territory.
That's right. But that's all history by now, so there's a Gibraltarian student studying at my university this year who's come to us via Kingston University in London, and for Gabby and her generation, this is a past they've heard their parents, people my age, talk about, or their grandparents, but it has no bearing on them, right? The border is now open, and so you've got Spain at your doorstep, you've got Morocco at your doorstep, Portugal's a short drive away, and from southern Spain, from the airport at Malaga, which is about an hour and a half north of Gibraltar, you can fly to anywhere in Europe and be there in a couple of hours at most. So,
any chance that the British would relent and say, okay, you can have your rock back?
Not by law, they can't. The British committed themselves to respecting the democratically expressed wishes of the people of Gibraltar. And Gibraltar is one of the very few colonies, or former colonies, I should say, at this point on Earth, whose people, at least for a while, identified with a colonial power and wanted to remain within the orbit of that colonial power. And it's for a very simple reason, and that is that, well, there are very few of us. It's 2.5 square miles, so there are only about 25,000 Gibraltarians.
It's an exclusive club.
Well, you could put it that way. But we had a very fragile sense of identity. This is our only home, this rock, and there's an aggressive power to our north trying to, bully us into accepting Spanish rule. And no Gibraltarian, or very few Gibraltarians, wanted to become Spanish. Certainly at a time when the country was ruled by a dictatorial regime, right? So the British at the time said, okay, we have to respect the wishes of the people of Gibraltar, and that's what they've done ever since.
So how many people in Gibraltar speak Spanish?
Well,
or feel any kind of connection?
There are numerous Gibraltarians with Spanish blood, right? My surname, my last name is Alvarez, a very common Spanish name. My mother's maiden name was Romero, very common Spanish name. And my generation, at least, and all previous generations, grew up speaking Spanish chiefly. Right? I grew up speaking Spanish, mostly Spanish at home, but English has always been the language, or at least since World War II, has been the language of education. So my generation is fully bilingual. The younger generation, so Gabby Martinez's generation, this young student who's at Grand Valley this year, they tend to only speak English. It's a very strange phenomenon. We all thought that once the border opened, we'd become totally bilingual. In fact, there's been a movement in the other direction, so it's a bit of a surprise.
Interesting.
But I mean, that'll change.
So having grown up in a place which is basically a British colony,
yes.
How does that influence your career choice and what you wanted to read about, learn about, study?
I think so, and I should specify that really, technically speaking, and legally, Gibraltar is no longer a colony. We're a British Overseas Territory. That's the official designation, a BOT. But I grew up as part of the last generation that really had familiarity with actual colonialism, right? So still in the 60s, Gibraltarians were in many respects second-class citizens, right? Much less so than they'd been in the 50s and even less so than in the 40s, but still, I grew up aware of superior attitudes on the part of colonial officials or British people from Britain who came to the Rock on holiday or what have you. It was, as things go, one of the more benign forms of colonialism, the kind that Gibraltarians experienced, at least until my generation, but it was colonialism nonetheless, right? It was, we know better than you, and you more or less have to do as we say. But that changed, and nowadays, even though it's in British hands, it's a place that enjoys a great deal of self-government, and whose people don't feel colonial or colonized. Sure. That now is a thing of my generation's past.
Sure. I'd like to transition a little bit
certainly.
And talk about your work, your teaching.
Right. Well, I came to the States to study at the University of Texas at Austin. It so happens that when I arrived in the States in the late 80s, in English departments, and my specialization is literature, colonialism began to get a lot of attention, right? For the very simple reason that the British ruled 1/4 of the world's land surface, and many of those former parts of the British Empire that became independent countries
especially in the 60s.
Have literatures in English, right? So India, Nigeria, Jamaica, Trinidad, all these countries and many more have literatures in English, and English departments, beginning in the late 80s especially, which is when I arrived in the States, began to really focus on that and say, well, what do these places have to tell us, and how can we enlarge the scope of English as we understand it, right? The language of England and the language of the United States, which is now the language of many more peoples besides. So that was very useful for me because it allowed me to specialize in the study of the cultural expression of colonized peoples, and made me realize that I was like these peoples in some respects, right? And we hadn't quite thought of ourselves like that. Because of the fear of Spain and the identification with Britain, I think we all thought we were kind of British people in the Mediterranean without really thinking of ourselves as colonized peoples. So I latched onto this subject, and it became my specialization. I've been teaching it ever since. Right?
Yeah, and you were, I think, doing some research with South Africa? Is that what you call
South Africa became my specialization, right? So when I was hired by Grand Valley in 1997, I'd just written a doctoral dissertation on South African literature of the apartheid period, right? The time when the country was ruled by a system of racial segregation, right? And produced a rich literature in all the languages of South Africa, but especially in English, which was my specialty, and that's what I chiefly taught when I got here. And since then, my interests have expanded, but that remains a constant in my career, the study of South Africa. Fascinating country, especially for students of literature.
So what do your students learn?
So they learn about South Africa, for instance, a country that shares many similarities with the United States. So in learning about these other countries, and I was hired not just to teach South African literature, but to internationalize my students' understanding, right? It was an objective of the university administration at Grand Valley in the late 90s when I was hired to really bring the outside world, the world beyond our borders, into the classroom, so people like me got hired. People who had an academic specialization in the world out there, but also personal experience of it, right? And so they learn a lot about places like South Africa or places like Palestine and Israel, and in so doing they learn something about their own country, right? Because colonialism is relevant to Americans as well, right? It's hard for us to see that, I think, and I say us because I've been here since 1989, so even though I may not sound American, I feel American in many respects, and I think all this is really interesting to students, right, who tend not to know, our students tend not to know much about the world beyond their borders, but are very curious about it, right, and eager to learn. So,
what is their biggest discovery?
That's a huge question. I don't know. They make many discoveries. Some of them uncomfortable. I mean, this is, colonialism is not, in many respects, a pleasant subject, right? It entails, typically, one people's subjugation of another people, and all sorts of unpleasant things result from that in many situations. But they discover, I think, that they're smarter than they think, that they can understand the world out there, that given the right tools they can make sense of its complexity, right? And that's what I'm there to do. So I facilitate that understanding to the best of my ability, and I'm always really happy to see just how positively students tend to respond. Not always, right?
Do many of your students pick up and do international study, international travel because of your teaching? Well,
I mostly teach English majors. Right, so what I do is introduce them to the literatures in English beyond the United States and the United Kingdom, right? That vast world out there, at least portions of it, right? And I introduce them to international issues, right? So, in part because of my specialization in South Africa, and in part because I took courses on Palestinian and Israeli literature in grad school at the University of Texas, I've also, for the past few years, been teaching that subject, and that takes us right into the the world on our news, right, every evening. So,
and speaking of the world on our news screens every night, you've recently taken up with a cause called Healing Children of Conflict.
That's right. That's right.
Can you make the connection for us?
I will. Healing Children of Conflict is a Grand Rapids-based all-volunteer organization that has a twofold mission. On the one hand, it tries to bring children who've been injured in conflicts in the Middle East that involve the United States in one fashion or another to Grand Rapids for medical treatment. So a few years ago we brought an Iraqi boy who lost his, I think it was his left leg, when a US missile struck his house in Baghdad during the most recent invasion of Iraq, right? And here at Mary Free Bed, the doctors were able to attach a prosthesis to his body, and for the first time in a while this boy could walk. They weren't able to do anything about the shrapnel embedded in his torso, but they provided him treatment that he's not able to obtain at home. We've also tried to bring a boy from Gaza, but that's proven very difficult. So that's one part of our mission, and we'll try and continue to do that despite the enormous logistical obstacles, as you can imagine. And then the other branch, the other part of our mission is to educate the community here in West Michigan about the root causes of these conflicts, right? We tend not to be very well informed about them in this country, it seems to me, and it seems to my colleagues in the organization. So we do our bit to bring speakers, to host documentary screenings, and thereby do what we can to educate the public. And this involvement with this group arises directly from the work I do in the classroom. For some time I'd been teaching poems by a South African friend of mine, Ingrid de Kock, who's a very fine South African poet, that focus specifically on children under apartheid, right? And doing that work and realizing that there are children now in the world suffering, whether in Gaza or in the West Bank or in Iraq or what have you, right, in any number of places, made me want to do something about it. So it was a really lovely discovery to know that there was an organization in town that had been, trying to bring children and eventually managed to bring a child for treatment.
So if people are interested in helping out this cause, how would they get in touch with your organization?
Well, they can visit our website, healingchildrenofconflict.com. Right, or they can send an email to healingchildrenofconflict@gmail.com, and one of our volunteers will be glad to reply to whatever questions they might have.
Awesome. We're going to have to wrap up in just a minute.
Okay.
But in your world itinerancy,
yes,
what have you managed to discover about belonging?
Belonging is a very complicated matter for me because, in part, I feel I belong here. I have spent the last 30 years of my life here. I came here when I was around 20. It's been a long time, obviously. I have roots here now, I could say. A son, colleagues, a great job, students, former students, a whole life, right? But whenever I go back home, it's harder than ever to leave, right? I still feel I belong there. So I belong in at least two places, right? And that's not easy unless you're very wealthy and can just travel back and forth whenever you like. For most of us, it's hard to belong in two places, but it also has its joys, right? I can fully enjoy myself there and fully enjoy myself here and derive the best of both worlds. So
awesome.
I try to focus on that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure for your students it's a great joy to have a little bit of the world open to them, and so continued success in your teaching.
Thank you very much.
And certainly in this new project, Healing Children of Conflict. It sounds like a really important mission, so good luck in that.
Thank you, Alan. Thanks very much.